My name is Marcus Webb. I'm 28 years old, and I helped install the wildlife cameras that taught something else how to see. I work nights as a maintenance and security tech for the state conservation grid in a rural stretch of land most people only drive through. A place of long trees, shallow creeks, and dead zones where cell service drops like the world forgets you exist. I wear the same thing every shift, black hoodie with a faded logo, dark jeans, steel-toe work boots, because nights out here are cold, wet, and unforgiving, and practicality keeps you alive longer than comfort. The cameras were supposed to be simple, motion-activated trail units wired into a centralized network so biologists could track migration patterns without stepping into the woods themselves. Deer, coyotes, feral dogs, birds, data, numbers, paths. Nothing supernatural. Nothing intelligent. That was the lie we all believed at first. The first sign something was wrong came 2 weeks after activation, when camera C-17 flagged continuous presence without motion. That shouldn't be possible. Motion sensors don't trigger if nothing moves. But the feed showed a forest clearing at night, perfectly still, moonlight washing over ferns and damp soil, and right in the center of the frame stood a shape that looked like a deer until you stared too long. It wasn't moving, not breathing, not blinking. Just standing there, head angled slightly toward the camera, eyes reflecting infrared like glass marbles. I waited for it to flinch. It didn't. After 9 minutes, the system auto-logged it as environmental artifact and moved on. The next morning, 6 more cameras flagged the same anomaly. Different locations, same behavior, shapes resembling animals, positioned exactly where the lens could see them best, holding still far longer than biology allows. I was told it was a firmware issue. Compression ghosting. Light bleed. I believed that explanation until the night the cameras started adjusting themselves. I was on shift alone, running diagnostics in the control trailer, when I noticed camera D04 slowly pan downward even though it wasn't a PTZ unit. The movement was subtle, almost polite, like someone nudging a mirror to get a better angle. The feed settled on a clearing where something stood just outside frame. Then inch by inch it leaned forward until its face filled the screen. Not a deer, not anymore. The proportions were wrong, eyes too forward, jaw too flexible, skin stretched tight over bone like it had been pulled into shape rather than grown. And the worst part wasn't how it looked. It was how it waited, perfectly centered, perfectly framed, like it understood composition. My radio chirped before I could look away, spilling out a low, layered tone that vibrated behind my eyes. Then my phone lit up with an emergency alert that didn't list whether fire or flood. Emergency notice, wildlife camera network active. Do not approach animals exhibiting prolonged stillness. Do not adjust CAMERAS manually. I remember thinking that last line was strange. No one adjusts cameras manually unless something has gone wrong. Outside the trailer, the forest was silent. No insects. No wind. I checked the exterior feed and felt my stomach drop. Every camera now showed the same thing. Animal-shaped figures standing at the exact edge of each frame, never fully entering, never fully leaving, heads tilted at matching angles as if following a rule. On camera A02, a fox-shaped thing raised one forelimb and lowered it again, slow and deliberate, like it was practicing a gesture it had seen before. On camera B11, a deer thing shifted its weight, corrected its posture, and held still again, as if disappointed with the previous attempt. Then the system flagged a new status across the network in plain white text I had never seen before. User detected. I wasn't in the woods. I was in a locked trailer miles from the nearest camera. But one by one, the feeds began to change, no longer showing forests or clearings, but angles I recognized, maintenance roads, the side of the trailer, the steps leading up to the door. The cameras were no longer watching animals. They were using animals to learn how to watch us. And somewhere out there, in the dark beyond the tree line, something was standing very still, learning exactly where to place itself next. I didn't leave the trailer after the user-detected status appeared, because leaving would have confirmed whatever assumption the system had just made about proximity, and I was already too aware of how quickly the cameras were learning thresholds. Instead, I killed the interior lights and brought them back on out of sequence, forcing shadows to move unpredictably. then pulled the camera admin console up on a secondary monitor and watched the network rewrite itself in real time. Camera IDs began duplicating, splitting like cells, C17A, C17B, each one showing the same clearing from microscopically different angles, not because the cameras had moved, but because something in the frame had learned how to stand where perspective changes mattered. Outside, the forest remained unnaturally quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your ears until you realize you're holding your breath to match it. My phone vibrated again with a follow-up alert, shorter, blunter. Do not interact with observed subjects. Interaction includes gesture, vocalization, and camera refocus. That last part made my chest tighten because I hadn't touched the focus controls, and yet camera D04 zoomed another fraction closer on its own, correcting for a depth error like an eye adjusting. The creature on that feed, because I couldn't call it an animal anymore, tilted its head in response, mirroring the change, its neck bending with a flexibility that looked practiced rather than painful. I reached for the manual shutdown binder, fingers slipping on laminated pages, and found a section I'd never seen before tucked between power failure protocols and wildlife interference reports. Project Parallax, integrated under conservation grid. The language was dry, technical, but the implications weren't. Objective: evaluate non-human utilization of optical infrastructure. Hypothesis: prolonged passive observation enables adaptive framing behavior. One line was underlined so hard it had torn through the paper beneath. If a subject can learn where it is seen, it can learn where it is not. On the monitors, the fox-shaped thing raised its forelimb again, slower this time, paw hovering midair as if waiting for confirmation. I realized with a sick lurch that it wasn't practicing waving, it was practicing stopping at the right point in the frame, learning the edge. The radio on the wall crackled, bleeding out that same layered tone, and then a voice came through that wasn't dispatch, not exactly, a calm male voice with no identifying markers. Maintain operations, it said. Do not break continuity. Continuity of what? Observation, learning. Outside, movement rippled at the tree line as more shapes arrived. Not rushing, not clustering, but spacing themselves with intention, each one finding a place where it could be partially seen without fully entering view. Deer things, dog things, something bird-like perched too low to be natural, all holding stillness like a skill. Camera A flagged again, this time for gesture repetition, and the feed showed the fox thing adjusting its posture, correcting a slight lean, then freezing, satisfied. I tried to force myself to look away, to stop feeding the loop, but every instinct trained by years of screens and alerts dragged my eyes back, and I hated that part of myself most of all. My phone buzzed again. No alert tone now, just a message with a gray background and a federal routing tag, Project Parallax active. Subject behavior within acceptable variance. Subject: singular, me. I backed away from the monitors and knocked over a chair on purpose, letting it crash and scrape to introduce noise that wasn't clean. The creatures outside didn't react, but the cameras did. The feeds jittered, auto-stabilization fighting my disruption, tightening their frames like they were annoyed. On camera B11, the deer thing's mouth opened slightly, lips pulling back in a way that wasn't a snort or a bleat, jaw working as if mapping shapes it had only heard described. The forest edge shifted again, and I caught a glimpse of something taller behind the animals, its outline smoothing and sharpening as it repositioned, never quite settling, like it was still deciding which shape fit the infrastructure best. My phone vibrated hard enough to sting my palm, and this time the message felt less like an alert and more like instruction. Animal PROXIES successful. Optical utilization expanding. Do not power down. That confirmed what I'd been trying not to say out loud. The animals weren't the threat, they were the interface. The cameras hadn't just been built to watch wildlife. They'd been built to teach something how to watch through wildlife, using bodies we trusted, shapes we ignored, patience we underestimated. The trailer door creaked softly, not opening, just testing its hinge, and I realized someone, or something, had learned where sound mattered. I grabbed my keys and forced myself to move badly, dropping them once, bending to pick them up at an awkward angle because smoothness felt like consent now. On the exterior feed, the fox thing shifted its weight, correcting to stay perfectly framed, and I understood the next phase without needing to read it. Once it knew how to be seen, it would learn how to move without being noticed at all. The radio voice returned, closer this time, layered with a faint distortion like wind through leaves. "Marcus Webb," it said, using my name without asking. "You're doing fine, just keep watching." That was when I pulled the breaker for the trailer lights and plunged myself into darkness, not because I thought it would stop them, but because I needed one moment where the cameras didn't get a clean image of my face deciding what to do next. Darkness didn't stop the cameras. It just forced them to adjust, and I felt that adjustment like pressure in my sinuses. A slow recalibration as infrared overlays ghosted back onto the monitors, outlining the trailer interior in pale, wireframe the way targeting systems do when they don't need light to understand shape. I crouched low, keeping my head down, breathing in uneven bursts to avoid settling into a rhythm, and listened as the forest outside began to move, not rushing, not chaotic but repositioning, the sound of leaves parting carefully, branches flexing without snapping, bodies learning how to travel without announcing weight. I edged toward the rear exit, every step wrong on purpose, heel first then toe, stopping mid-motion to break cadence, and glanced once, just once, at the main monitor wall. The feeds had changed again. No animals now, no forests. Every screen showed variations of the same thing. The trailer, the maintenance road, the tree line behind it, all from angles that didn't correspond to any physical camera placement, as if the system had learned how to synthesize viewpoints once it understood the space. A status line scrolled along the bottom in clean white text, frame dependency achieved. I didn't know what that meant, but my body did because the pull behind my eyes intensified, an urge to stand up straight, to present myself cleanly, to give them a better shot. I bit the inside of my cheek until I tasted blood and forced myself to crawl, scraping my hoodie on the floor so the fabric rasped loud and ugly. The radio voice came again, softer now, layered with a faint delay like an echo learning where to land. "You're adapting," it said, almost pleased. "That improves resolution." Outside, a shape crossed the exterior feed, too tall to be any animal native to these woods, moving with a smoothness that suggested it wasn't constrained by joints so much as guided by intention. It stopped at the edge of the frame and corrected its posture, shoulders angling, head tilting, until it occupied the negative space perfectly. That was when I understood Project Parallax wasn't about cameras teaching something else how to see. It was about teaching something how to compose. The animals were just practice subjects, forgiving models that held still while the system learned framing, patience, and the difference between presence and intrusion. I reached the rear door and cracked it open just enough to slip through, keeping my body turned sideways so no clean silhouette presented itself, and dropped into the wet grass behind the trailer. The night air felt heavier here, charged, and the forest edge was wrong, too orderly, gaps between trunks aligning into corridors that hadn't existed before. Deer things stood there, not in a herd but in a grid, each one occupying a position that maximized visibility without overlap, eyes forward-facing, calm as mannequins. A fox-shaped proxy stepped out and raised its forelimb again, stopping precisely at the frame boundary, paw hovering like it was measuring an invisible line. I realized it wasn't practicing gesture anymore. It was practicing not crossing, learning restraint, learning how to remain unseen by staying exactly where attention failed. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I'd forgotten I still had it, and I almost dropped it in panic before reading the message stamped with the same federal routing tag. Phase 3, Spatial Utilization. Subject mobility desirable. Desirable for who? I bolted anyway, not straight, not fast, zigzagging across the maintenance road and into the brush, branches tearing at my clothes, boots slipping in mud, because if they wanted mobility, I would give them chaos. Behind me, I heard movement respond, not chasing but reassigning positions, the grid flowing like water around obstacles, each proxy finding a new place to stand that preserved coverage. The siren tone returned faintly, not as a broadcast but as a resonance, vibrating through the ground and up my legs, and I stumbled as my own stride tried to sink to it. I forced myself to fall, roll, stand again, breaking the loop. Ahead, headlights flared, unmarked trucks rolling slow with their beams angled down to avoid long shadows, and the forest proxies reacted immediately, stepping back into cover, dissolving into stillness so complete they vanished unless you knew where to look. Nets hissed through the air, not thrown wildly but placed, catching shapes that had miscalculated spacing, handlers moving with rhythmic shouts and noisemakers designed to poison pattern recognition. A device screamed, a harsh, broken sound that made my vision blur, and the pressure eased just enough for me to breathe. Hands grabbed my arms and dragged me backward, human hands, shaking, pulling me toward a transport whose engine idled unevenly like it had been taught to stutter. As they shoved me inside, I saw one last thing at the tree line. The tall shape lingering behind the animal proxies, its outline smoothing, adjusting, learning where it could stand without being detected, as if this intervention was just another dataset. Inside the vehicle, lights flickered deliberately out of sync, and a man with tired eyes sat across from me counting under his breath, refusing to let his gaze settle. "We can stop the broadcast," he said quietly like a confession, "but we can't stop a method once it's learned." I asked him what it was. He shook his head. "It's not a thing," he said. "It's a way of using what we built." The transport lurched into motion, taking turns that didn't map to the road, and behind us the forest closed ranks, proxies resettling into their grids, patient and calm, practicing how to be exactly where no one would think to look. They didn't take me somewhere official after they pulled me out of the grid. They took me somewhere deliberately forgettable. A concrete transit depot repurposed into a containment site where every surface was matte, every corner rounded, every reflective object either removed or scarred on purpose so no clean angles survived. The transport's engine kept misfiring even after we stopped, idling in an arrhythmic stutter like the machine itself had been trained not to settle. And the man with tired eyes never stopped counting under his breath as he walked me inside, prime numbers breaking the silence where my instincts tried to impose rhythm. Inside the depot, paper maps replaced screens, analog clocks ticked at slightly different speeds, and the lights flickered just enough to ruin depth perception. "Phase 4 is interruption," the man finally said, still not looking directly at me. "We don't destroy the method, we starve it." He showed me a wall covered in printed stills pulled from the wildlife network, frames where animals stood too still, frames where something else stood behind them, frames where the camera angle didn't make sense anymore because it wasn't coming from a lens at all. "It learned how to use what you built," he continued. "Now we have to teach it that nothing stays stable long enough to finish a picture." Outside the depot, the night crawled with motion that never quite resolved into pursuit. Through slit windows cut too narrow to frame a body, I saw proxies, animal-shaped, calm, patient, repositioning themselves just beyond the light, never clustering, never rushing, always maintaining coverage. Deer things stood shoulder-width apart, fox things corrected posture when light shifted, bird-like shapes perched low and still where shadows broke lines of sight. They weren't trying to get in. They were mapping the perimeter by absence, learning where guards didn't linger, where light patterns repeated. The siren tone returned faintly, not broadcast, but residual, humming through concrete like a memory the building couldn't forget. A handler slammed a metal bar against the floor without warning, then dragged it, then stopped abruptly, poisoning cadence, and I felt the pressure ease a fraction, like whatever was listening had lost its place. Hours blurred. Interventions flared and faded, noise bursts, light disruptions, teams rotating positions out of pattern, each one buying minutes, not victory. At one point, alarms went silent all at once, and the stillness that followed felt heavier than any siren. Every proxy outside froze, perfectly framed by darkness, and for a heartbeat I understood how close it was to finishing something. The man with tired eyes swore softly and ordered a full pattern break. Engines roared unevenly, lights stuttered, doors opened and closed without sequence, and the proxies hesitated, just enough to recalculate. That hesitation saved us. Near dawn, they moved me again, farther from the grid, farther from anything that could be mistaken for a lens. Before I left, the man finally met my eyes just for a second. "If it shows you," he said, echoing words I'd read before, "it's because it already knows you're there. Your job now is to never let it finish learning." As we drove, I saw the proxies thin out, dissolving into stillness that looked like normal forest if you didn't know how to see the grid underneath. But I knew, and I knew this wasn't an escape. It was a delay. 6 months after Project Parallax was officially decommissioned, the state quietly expanded the wildlife camera program under a different name, and most people never noticed because nothing was ever announced loudly when the goal was to keep attention from settling. I was relocated again, farther this time, to an industrial maintenance job that had nothing to do with forests or animals. Same nights, same uniform, black hoodie with the faded logo, dark jeans, steel-toe work boots, because familiarity made me easier to manage and less likely to ask questions. I signed forms I wasn't allowed to keep and memorized rules that weren't written down. Never walk the same route twice. Never stand still when a camera is visible. Never look directly into a lens longer than a heartbeat. And if you ever see an animal holding still for too long, leave the area immediately without acknowledging it. Officially, the incident was categorized as infrastructure misuse via unauthorized firmware learning. Unofficially, the men who checked in on me, always out of sync with each other, never standing in clean lines, admitted parallax hadn't been stopped, only slowed. The method still existed. The animals still existed as proxies. The only difference was scale. The new cameras were smaller, smarter, embedded in traffic lights, doorbells, parking structures, places no one questioned because being seen there felt normal. I started noticing the signs again, subtle at first. Dogs sitting beneath security cameras with their heads tilted at identical angles. Deer at the edge of industrial parks standing just outside floodlight range, bodies positioned to catch reflections off windows. Birds perching near lenses and holding eye contact until the feed cut. Calm animals, patient animals, animals that understood framing. One night, walking home under uneven streetlights, I passed a newly installed camera pole and felt that familiar pressure behind my eyes, the urge to slow down, to adjust my posture, to give it a cleaner look. I forced myself to stumble instead, scraping my boot, turning abruptly, making myself a bad subject, and the pressure eased, but not completely. 2 weeks ago, an internal memo leaked online for less than an hour before vanishing, stamped post-parallax observation, and one line lodged itself in my head like a splinter. Animal proxies demonstrate declining necessity as the system refines autonomous spatial inference. They didn't need animals as much anymore. The cameras had learned enough. Tonight, as I write this, there's a wildlife camera mounted on the utility pole across from my apartment where there wasn't one yesterday. It isn't pointed at the trees. It's angled toward the building, lens dark, inactive, perfectly patient. Beneath it, just at the edge of the light, something stands very still. It looks like a dog if you don't focus. If you do, the proportions slip. Legs too straight, head too level, posture too intentional. It isn't looking at me. It's looking at the camera, correcting its position by fractions of an inch, practicing where to stand so it can be seen without being noticed. I don't watch long. I move instead, uneven and human, because I know the truth now, and it's worse than any emergency alert they could send. We built wildlife cameras to watch the forest, and something else learned how to use them to watch us. And once a system learns how to see without being seen, it doesn't need permission, and it never needs to stop.